That's all. Singenele Dlamini. Zizi. Wavela phela watshona. Siyakubulisa Africa. Ngale Africa Day. Sithemba basiyavana emakhaya. Sicela ukuba ke sixolise for the technical glitch that we had. We were sorting out some few things because what we realized was to change a platform so that during this week we can be able to interact with the discussions and topics that we bring about. We notice in Dogoba sisenza interactive sessions, it becomes a challenge for people to ask questions. Therefore, we are launching and piloting this project yoba sibene facilitate and anchor ezakuthi inikezele ku-presenters to present and then be able to freely engage abantu ngendlela efanelekileyo. I'm just testing for today, and then as we move forward, we will have a young person who will be the anchor of this sessions that we'll be having throughout the week, so that we engage abantu. We noticed that, for an example, when Mrs. Sikupela was interacting with you were not able to ask questions about live way too. It does not allow a presenter to present while at the same time getting questions that you'll be able to answer from your side. Therefore, this platform has been created, and we are so grateful to the Central Methodist Circuit 901 Umfundisi uNcombo for affording us to use their premium platform. Without further ado, we will give over to our presenter for today, which needs no more introduction. The son of the soil, Umfundisi Gxamza. As you're about to lead us this evening. Dambo.
Yes. Are you able to? Am I audible, Vulan?
Yes, you are audible, Noveche. Continue.
No, thank you very much, Vulane. Allow me first to begin by taking this opportunity to greet you as the host this evening, and also to greet our brothers and sisters, sons and daughters of Africa scattered across the connection. Friends, I warmly greet you all this evening in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, saying to all of you, grace and peace be upon you. I wish also to take this opportunity and welcome amongst us those who might not necessarily be members of the Methodist Church, but are believers that Africa needs healing and Africa needs transformation. And so I greet you, and I take this time also to welcome you. And we just want to thank you once again for your patience when you're dealing with the likes of Mvulane. We must know and accept that we are dealing with people who are techno peasants. Thank you very much. I wish also to, at this point, right at the beginning, to extend warm greetings to the former presiding bishop of our church, Dr. Reverend Mvume Dandala, whom I had an opportunity to engage sometime during this day. And he has sent to all of you Methodist people around this connection warm and Christian greetings. Friends, I have been asked this evening to share my thoughts with you on a subject that I feel it's very important, especially at this time, for all Methodist people in this, our beloved connection, considering that it is Africa Month, and the young people of this church have asked me to share my thoughts and reflections on the theme of our beloved Church of Christ Healed Africa for the healing of nations. And I want to say it from the very beginning that I do not claim monopoly of wisdom. All I am going to do with you this evening is to share some of my thoughts and the way in which I have structured this evening's reflection or presentation is in such a way that for the first 15 minutes, I will do a brief presentation. And towards the 15 minutes, I will then invite questions. Our facilitator, Reverend Stemele, will collect those questions and I will try and respond, even though I have declared from the very onset that I do not claim monopoly of wisdom on these issues. The first thing that I have done when I was asked was to engage, most fortunately for us, the person who was at the helm of the church when the church decided to craft this vision of a Christ-healed Africa is still alive. So there is no much speculation that one needs to do. All I needed to do was really to approach Reverend Mvume Dandala, who was happy to talk to me about the vision of a Christ-healed Africa for the healing of nations. And the questions that I had was, what is the sickness? What is it that we as Africans need to be healed from? And I asked, what is the source of this sickness from which we need healing from? And so the last thing I asked him was, how is the healing of Africa going? How is it going to mean that by healing of Africa, you will be healing nations, you will be healing the world? And so basically, I wanted to understand how Mvume Dandala and the leadership at the time came to say and to call for all of us as Methodist people into a Christ-healed Africa for the healing of nations. And I just want to share some of the discussions I had with him. That one, perhaps before I do that, let me provide you with what I have termed the tail end, in case technology plays funny tricks once again on us. I have summed up the presentation. Hope that when we arrive at a point where we are going to engage, all of us, we would have understood that I wanted to say, as guided by this vision, that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, freedom and equality for their souls. And so for me, in summary, that is what it means when we speak of a Christ-healed Africa for the healing of nations. And so in my conversation with Reverend Vume Dandala, as a way of introduction, I realized that Mfundisi Dandala recognized, having traveled around the world, that Africans had a common destiny. Africans, wherever they were, be it in South Africa, be it Africans in the diaspora, those Africans have a common destiny. He went on to say that we have common problems as Africans. And amongst those, he highlighted hunger, he highlighted diseases, and he highlighted ignorance. And he concluded by saying, the bar that needs to be used to heal Africa and to heal the world was Christ Jesus. Hence, a Christ-healed Africa for the healing of nations. And so I realized that Mfundisi Vume Dandala understood what Ubiko said when he addressed Gxamza in 1972 in Pietermaritzburg, that where people are subjected to a religion that is removed from their cultural makeup, elements of disgruntlement begin to be noted, and sometimes an open defiance is soon displayed. That is what Steve Biko said in 1972 as he was addressing Gxamza in Pietermaritzburg. And so Mfundisi Dandala understood that the church is in this world. The church is for the world, even though the church is not of this world. And so he understood that South Africa, or the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, could never operate in isolation or be divorced to what was happening in the society in which it finds itself. And so one can say without any fear of contradiction that the vision of a Christ-healed Africa was anchored in what Africans call, or Africanists call, the vision of the African founding fathers. So it was not a vision that came out of nowhere, but it was a vision that was linked to the vision of the African founding fathers. Fortunately, today we are celebrating Africa Day in an Africa month, a month that is important to Africans, especially those of us who are Methodist. Why this month is important? One, it's because it was in this month, on the 24th of May, that 32 leaders of states and government who at the time had been liberated from the yoke of colonialism, gathered in Ethiopia in Addis Ababa to discuss, but most importantly, to pledge their commitment and support that they shall never rest until the entire African continent was liberated. Because Tomboye was a trade unionist, a young trade unionist in Kenya. He once said, trying to explain how we view things as Africans. He said, as Africans, we are clan-minded, we are tribal-minded, and in that, we are communal in our approach. And so those 32 heads of states and government who gathered in Ethiopia in Addis Ababa in 1963, a very historic meeting in a life and the future and the state of Africa even today. Those leaders understood that it doesn't matter. Ghana could have been liberated earlier in 1959, but it did not matter. For Ghana to be liberated alone was meaningless. In fact, the then leader of Ghana, the founding democratic president of Ghana, Osajefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, said, the liberation of Ghana means nothing if it is not linked to the liberation of the continent of Africa. And so this is the spirit that was caught by the leadership that served with Umfundisi Umvume Dandala. In other words, if you want to locate and understand the vision of a Christ-healed Africa, you need to understand the commitments that were made in 1963 Ethiopia in Addis Ababa. Those of you who follow the history, you would understand that when Umfundisi Dandala and the leadership collective called for a Christ-healed Africa for the healing of nations, in this country, President Thabo Mbeki, the former president of this country, was calling for an African renaissance. Even before he was a president, he made a speech that is celebrated throughout the continent and the world, a speech that was titled, I Am an African. That speech was in itself an adaptation from the speech of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was from the Caribbean. And Umfundisi Dandala, when they called for a Christ-healed Africa, it was linked to what was happening in Southern Africa, but also linked to the vision of the African founding fathers. But in order, Mfundisi wami, in order for me to remain faithful to the subject that I have been asked to address, I ask that you grant me latitude to go back in history so that we can understand why Africa needed healing. Maybe without going far back, in 2001, the friend of Robert Mugabe, Gabriel Mugabe, Tony Blair, I know that President Mugabe was a great friend of Tony Blair, said in the United Nations that Africa is a scar on the conscience of the world. But if the world as a community focuses on it, it could heal Africa. And if the world does not do that, the wound will become even deeper and Africa even angrier. But what he did not say is that the world were co-authors of our misfortunes. If Africa was referred to then, or maybe still referred to as a scar in the conscience of humanity, it is because the world, in particular Europe, are co-authors of African misfortunes. In other words, if the West is the first world country, it is what it is because of Africa. I'm not sure if I am making sense, but if I am not, this is what I mean. Our problems as Africans, which led to this that we are now terming a wound, are as a result of what we call the expansion of European commercial markets. Our problems, all our problems as Africans, are as a result of the expansion of European commercial markets. You would know, you would remember that this continent, people of this continent, we were first enslaved. You would remember in 1712, Lynch went to the colony of Virginia. And when he got there, he gave the slave drivers a method on how to control their slaves. Who were those slaves? Those slaves were Africans. And the method was simple. Keep the Negro physically fit, but mentally weak. That is the essence of the model that he gave them on how to control the slaves. So we had been enslaved as Africans. Secondly, Africans had been colonized. Friends, the notable date or year, if you want to follow the colonization of Africa, is a conference that sat in Berlin in 1884, where the map of Africa was passed around, circulated, and European countries divided Africans. They shared it amongst themselves. You know, one African writer, when he dramatized what happened, he says, after that conference, you would sleep with your wife together as South Africans. And when you wake up, your wife would be a Zimbabwean, whilst the husband is a South African. Because it was in the partitioning of Africa, when we were being colonized as Africans, that the boundaries that we have grown to accept today came about. And so our problems and all this, if you trace it, in fact, I always say to those friends of mine who are politicians, that politics have never been about color and race. Politics have always been about the control of means of production. And so our problems were as a result of the expansion of European commercial markets. And the modus operandi was simple throughout Africa. You divide and rule them. That is what was used throughout. You divide and you rule them. So it was divide and conquer. It doesn't matter where you go. And because of that, in fact, before I get to that, you know, slavery, colonialism, and racism have always worked hand in hand. Slavery, colonialism, and racism, those have always worked hand in hand. In fact, racism was a need, came as a result of a need to justify the exclusion of African people in the participation of the economy of African countries. And so these things have always worked together. Remember, Methodism, in particular here in South Africa, arrived in 1795 with the soldiers. And later we were sent Barnabas Shaw. But the notable one was when the 1820 British settlers arrived in Salem, closer to what today is known as the Makhanda or the former Gxamza region. And upon their arrival, the settlers were here to expand because of the expansion of European commercial markets. In fact, William Shaw, who at the time was 21 years old, was in that ship as a chaplain to those British who had been brought here. And Umfundisi Tandala does not forget to tell this story whenever he speaks of that particular event. That when they arrived, Europeans had been told that they are going to a land of milk and honey. But upon their arrival, all they saw was forest after forest, and some of them began to weep. And it was William Shaw who stood up and reminded them, one, that you are British. You have a government who have given you a grant to come here. Secondly, you are Christians. Then look at these trees. What do they tell you about the soil beneath? And that's how they got the objective was to expand, was never anything else. Other things were added later, but primarily it was to expand. It was to expand the European commercial markets. And the question that perhaps you ask, then what was then the role of the church? So that I can hand over to the questions. You know, the church has always had one sin, this one sin. I'm not one to criticize the church. I've never been good to that because I love the church. In fact, ndiyakuthanda mina uba ngumfundisi. Ndiyazibona zonke ezinye izinto kodwa mina ndiyakuthanda uba ngumfundisi. And I realized that some of the doors that I've even been able to open, I have done so because the church has brought me closer to those doors. So I avoid criticizing the church. But the church has always had this one sin. And that sin, which is the sin of the church has this tendency of being asleep when it is supposed to be awake, and of being awake when the church is supposed to be asleep. Hence, you will discover when you read even the history of the church, that the church at some point was co-opted to advance what the Europeans had come here to do, which is to expand the European commercial markets. And at some point, the church or leaders of the church were co-opted. And the number one sin I always say, that the church, sometimes it keeps quiet when it is not supposed. But if I were to be sympathetic to the church, remember that life is about self-preservation. Sometimes people, because the church is a human institution, so it is prone ekutheni nayo izenze impazamo. Sometimes, once your life is threatened, sometimes you keep quiet. I am not justifying, by no means am I justifying oba icawa kwakutheni na ukuze ingathethi kwezi zinto. But at some point, the church was co-opted. Remember that the second breakaway, the first breakaway in the Methodist Church that is notable was that of Nehemiah Tile, who was a minister in the region that we know and understand as the Transkei in the Eastern Cape, amongst the Tembu people. And the problem, what gave rise to this breakaway was that he asked what he was perhaps was not supposed to ask. Why are we praying for Queen Elizabeth? And so he decided to replace Queen Elizabeth with the name of the Tembu paramount chief, or the king of Abatem. And that led to the breakaway. And so he refused to support Queen if it means he cannot support the Tembu paramount chief. The second one, which I want to make reference to, just to demonstrate that at some point the church, has this tendency of keeping quiet when it's supposed to speak, is the breakaway of 1892 by Mukone Mangena, who wrote, and I think he gave about 14 reasons as to why he was breaking away from the Methodist Church. And I want to quote number 11 of those reasons that he gave. And he said, and I quote, "Our meetings are held in a more or less a barbaric manner. We were just a lot of kephas before the long roads for passes. What the white man says is infallible, and no black man can prove it wrong. It shows that we cannot be brothers, he said. And he then said, no native minister is honored among the white brethren. The more the native humbles himself, the more they make a fool of that native. I hope this clearly demonstrates for us what was happening, and that the church has never been immune. Things that are happening in the society. Because if you read that clearly, though there were clear indications of racism within the church. And I have said racism, slavery, colonialism have always worked hand in hand, because life has always been about self-preservation. And so African ministers at some point, apart from the fact that those who came before him were treated more or less as evangelists, but clearly what was happening outside of the church is already manifesting itself within the church. What I'm doing, I'm locating, giving you a historic background for you to understand why a Christ healed Africa for the healing of nations. Few months ago, one of my friends, Reverend Nayisa, wrote on his Facebook that the church is the only army that shoots her own wounded. And that is what he was saying. It's exactly what was said by Mukune in those days. And some of those ministers left the church. We would know the Dwanes and many others. But others decided to struggle from within the church. Those who are members of the BMC will tell you that at some point they decided that they are going to struggle for transformation from within the church. So the vision of a Christ-healed Africa can be located in the vision of the African founding fathers of the meeting of 1963, of the unity of Africa, that Africa needs to unite. Africa needs to define her destiny. Africa needs to be able to feed herself, because English is right now, as it was in those days, that you can never bite the hand that feeds you. And so Africa needs to feed herself. If you do not believe me, if you ask yourself, how did Umfundisi Dandala and the leadership at the time thought we were going to achieve the healing of Africa for the healing of nations, you will realize or remember that Umfundisi Dandala was very serious about Africa being masters of their own destinies. But we need to know that he was operating from within the church. So he needed to begin from the church and transcend that what had been done from within the church, then with the hope overflow and influence society. Umfundisi Dandala made a call. I'm touching on the issue of a need for Africa to feed herself. Umfundisi Dandala made a call, and the leadership at the time of what was known as a millennium campaign. But some of us, we need to agree that this man must have been a man that came before his own time. I am saying this because he was daring, calling for the church to mobilize herself and raise 100 million rands. And that money needed to be invested for the benefit of the church. And that vision, because he was not really supported, I think they collected about only 14 million rands. But this is the vision that made some of our leaders, when they were in Kenya last year, I think in Kenya, in one of these African countries, celebrate and came back saying that country has a hotel that is run by the church. That is the same vision that Utatu Dandala championed when he joined the All African Council of Churches. And that was not a new vision. That was not a new vision at all. That vision was actually linked to Umukune, whom I have spoken about. When Umukune wanted to leave the church, he was afraid because he was not sure if Africans are able to stand on their own. You would know the systematic, philosophy of making Africans to feel as though they were subhumans. And so he was not sure. But Umukune was an uncle of Charlotte Maxeke. Charlotte Maxeke, we refer to her as a pioneer when we speak of the ideology and axiology of Pan-Africanism and African solidarity, because she was amongst the first people to go and study overseas. They say exposure is the greatest of all teachers. And so she wrote Charlotte Maxeke to her uncle and said to him, this is Mukul, don't worry, it can be done. I have seen it here in America, in places like Helen in Brooklyn, where places that were at the time infested by Black Americans who had caught the vision of Du Bois and the vision of Marcus Garvey, whom Bob Marley says Garvey was a buffalo soldier in the heart of America, and said it can be done. These people here have marshaled their resources. They are taking their children to school. They are educating their children. They are running their own businesses. These people here, these are Africans who came here through slavery, have built churches that are run properly. Hence, the church that was led by Mukuna was later financed from America and was called Ethiopian amongst the names Episcopal Church at the end, because he had been supported by Charlotte Maxeke. And so I am saying this, what Utatu Dandala called for in the Millennium Campaign, that we need to raise 100 million. And I wonder, had we done that, where would we be today? Because when he joined the All Africa Council of Churches, he built hotels. The All Africa Council of Churches finances herself. If you are sponsoring, you are doing that out of your generosity, not because they are in need. So a Christ healed Africa, Mfundisi Stemele, indicate for the healing of nations. Lastly, before I hand over to questions, you know, the struggle of Africans has always been the struggle of spiritual and material welfare of African people. It is Sobukwe who says this. It's not coming from my head. He says that we are engaged in the struggle. We are engaged in the struggle for the spiritual and material interests of the African people. And so, at the center of the struggle is spirituality as a generic concept, that which informs one's identity. Africans have always asked, fought for a right to define themselves. Linked with that were material interests. Friends, this thing of economy in our lifetime, land, you know, it's not a new thing. In fact, even before it was fashionable now, I think Methodists knew even long before that. And how was this going to be achieved? As per Mfundisi Dandala, you need to go and look at the imperatives of the church. One of those being economic development. And how are we going to know that we have achieved? The measure is a gross national happiness. So the measure, even in the Methodist Church as an institution, that they are successful, it's the gross connectional happiness. The members of the Methodist Church must be the ones who say they are happy. In other words, the gross connectional happiness is the measure that indeed we have achieved. If a vision, it's something that can ever be achieved. We have achieved the vision of a Christ-healed Africa for the healing of nations. I want to go back, Mfundisi Stemele, as I hand over to you, to what William Shaw said. I want to say to us as Methodists, we are Methodists, we are Christians, we can do it. Let me hand over to you, Mfundisi Stemele, for engagements and clarity-seeking questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Reverend Gxamza, for such an inspirational talk about Christ-healed Africa for the healing of the nations. Indeed, you have really made people to be aware of where we are as a church in relation to the theme or the vision that the Methodist people have long had of a Christ-healed Africa. There are some couple of questions, Mfundisi, that I would like you to know. They're a bit long, but I'll try and paraphrase and cut them short so that we can be able to answer them on time. Firstly, there's a comment from Mfundisi Umukhumutsi Dutluling, affirming you, saying thank you, Mtambo, for your passion for Africa and Black people, and the former Secretary General of the Azanian People Organization, Chris Swepu, says the cross on Biko is so appropriate. So those are the comments that I wanted to just kickstart with before I go to the questions. The first question is from Oratile Madiba, who says, how is the church expected to speak against that which it implemented, which is the colonial mandate that keeps oppressing Black people up to date? Mtambo.
Yes,
yes, and then I'll just go to another one so that I can at least take 2 or 3 or 4 questions. The second one is from Omandla Koza, which says, how would you advise members of the church in making sure that they benefit in the land which they live, unlike living like a mere settler in their own land. And the follow-up question to that is that the issue of governments, where you find out that people who occupy big positions in churches are the biggest looters from state purse, which is meant for the poor. The question is, how should the church, or the church will play a role in making sure that we have clean governments that work for the people? And then the last one for now, it will be from Upumzile Nomga, who asked the question, towards achieving the MCSA vision, which have articulated very well. He asked the question, are you convinced that the church employs appropriate methods to address some of the African problems you've just mentioned in Tambo? I hope those questions are clearer. If not, I will repeat them. But just take the few questions, then we'll take the last questions that are going to be coming up.
Okay, Mfundisi, you know, and this Bamba Ngazonke, one because of nerves, you know, as you can see, that I'm nervous because I'm traversing you know, a ground that it's difficult to traverse. But
okay. What is happening is that, for example, the first question, I think Mukhumuzi Dutleling came to answer that question, where he says that Akere, they are self-critical and introspective, and the prophets within the institution are enabled to put the spotlight on our darkness, which is what we are currently doing by having such discussions in terms of the topic that we brought forward. So I just want you to answer the question by Mandla Koza, which says, how would you advise members of the church to make sure that they benefit in the land that they live in, unlike living like settlers in their land?
Okay, thank you very much. Manbonge ke umfundisi uMkhumutsi umfundisi uMkhumutsi is my chaplain, a person who prays for me. Ndifuna ke oba ndiqale kule ndawo. I said in the beginning that the daring vision is that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies. People everywhere can have culture for their own mind and education. People everywhere can have equality and freedom for their, you know, spirituality. I joked at some point with a friend and said, touching on what Mfundisi Mkhumutsi has said, that, you know, we have produced more resolutions than we have, you know, done other things. And the fear with that, or the danger, is that when people want to manage you or to scare you, they, you know, come up with a law. And so it's you know, it's worrying that we as the church have been producing more resolutions than other things. If you were to trace and look at the past 10 years, you would be surprised. But the other thing is that, you know, I know that people say that the church, you know, has been part of a tool that was used to oppress African people. But remember what I said about life being about self-preservation. I doubt that the missionaries came here, to those who were missionaries, to oppress us, because no one ever goes to a river to contaminate the water. But sometimes it happens while the person is there that the water gets contaminated. And so we need to understand when we speak of the church that, one, church or religion is a human institution. And because it is a human institution, there is no way, because it's prone to making challenges or to making mistakes. But what we tend or wish to do is to throw out the baby with the water. Christ is innocent. Religion might not be innocent. And I think we need to know that. And I think I need to state and submit that the church or religion in general might not be innocent, but Christ is innocent. Yes, we agree that when Christ was brought in Africa, in fact, it is big on that very same Gxamza conference. From a lay person's perspective, Biko says it is funny that religion, in particular Christianity, has gone through cultural adaptation from the Jewish culture, Roman culture, and other cultures. But when it got here in Africa, it has refused to adapt to African cultures. And that is not Christ's fault. That is the fault of religion. And because religion, it's a human institution, iyazenza impazamo zazo. The issue of land, bazalwane, I have said this elsewhere, that, umhlaba ukhona apha. Umzekelo wami ngumfundisi uQuluba. Bazalwane. Umfundisi uQuluba useFranksburg. And umfundisi uQuluba is beginning to produce at an industrial scale, impregnating umhlaba, ufuyile. And I think there needs to be a revolution from within the church that seeks to say, masisebenzise what we have. I know for the fact in my home circuit, A-Leaf, we have a vast land that can be used for, an honorable land that can be used either for crop production or can be used for farming. But it can never be from above. It needs to come from below. In fact, I think the Methodist, understanding of mission is that mission springs from below, and the church simply encourages and manages the process. I'm not sure if I'm making sense of this.
Let's go to the next question, Tambo. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm finished.
Oh, okay. The next question is that from Pumzile Nomga, who asks, towards achieving the MCSA vision, are you convinced that the church employs appropriate methods to address some of the African problems that you have mentioned? And then the other question is from Sintembile Khacha, who asked, Rev, do you think as church leaders we are doing enough to transform, liberate Africans in our small synods, circuits, and societies? And then I will end with other 3 questions, but you can try and explain further to those 2 questions that I've mentioned to you.
It's difficult, Mfundisi. Fortunately, I said from the very beginning that I do not claim monopoly, of
Please raise your voice a little bit, Mfundisi. Can you please raise your voice a bit?
Okay, Mfundisi. Is it better now?
Thank you.
I did say from the very beginning, Mfundisi, that I do not think, I said that I do not claim monopoly of wisdom. But what I know, maybe to respond to Nomga, Okuti, it doesn't matter where you go. In fact, Mfundisi Dandala did say this to me, that if you get in America, they look at you as an African. And we need to start as Africans, especially as Methodists, who are custodians of this vision. We need to begin to unite and encourage the unity of Africa. Yes, some of the things, we can never absorb ourselves, but we have an opportunity to correct some of those challenges. Busithini lo wesibini mfundisi?
Ndambo is from Semtembile, asking, do you think as church leaders we are doing enough to transform, liberate Africans in our small synods, circuits, and societies?
I do not know what would be enough. What would be the measure of enough? I do not know. But I know that we now, there is a policy, and we need to be intentional of a 40-40-20. I hope, now that we are going to be introduced to what is termed a new normal, maybe we'll turn it around and have a 60-20-20, because this is the time where we need to be led by young people. But all I can say is that any institution whose young people are in constant sleep or slumber, that nation or institution will never realize her potential. And you need to remember, if young people need space, for an example, it's like freedom. Freedom can never be given to you. Who doesn't want to be in control? You need to take it, because no one will hand it over to you. You need to take it. So, you know what the Wesley Guild South Africa has done, for an example, during these past few months, ever since we have been locked down? They have proven beyond reasonable doubt that the church is in good hands and the church needs young people. In fact, if the church, I've never been, in any of these structures of the church, even at a synod level, but if the church has what it's called elsewhere a think tank, this is the time when the presiding bishop and other, entities within the church need to loop in young people as advisors, in terms of how we need to chant a way forward. But if you think space will be given to you, freedom will be given to you, no, it will never happen. It will never happen. You will forever be told that you are a church of tomorrow. You are a church of tomorrow. You are a church of tomorrow, until you claim the space. And those ministers who love young people at heart, who are still young at heart, some of us, we need to be intentional to expose young people in our various, from a society level up to a synod level.
Thank you very much, Mfundisi Mtambo. I think the discussion that we are currently having is raising a lot of questions, which I think will be difficult for us to deal with them within an hour that has been allocated for us in this platform. And we will talk with the admins and those who are in charge of the platform to make another slot for us to be able to deal with more of the issues that are brought before this platform. But let's be charged of being not fair to people who ask questions. I'm going to throw two last questions to you, Mtambo, and then after that we will be able to close this platform. And just want to say to our Facebook followers, we appreciate your comments, we appreciate your questions, but because of time, we will not be able to go through to all of your questions and your comments. We will make sure that we will come back for another session, because we can see that the discussion is hot, And it is important for us to be able to make a time for us to deal with this matter of Christ-Shield Africa for the healing of the nations. The question from Uqasebe Lungisele Akona Kachai is, please write this down, Mtambo. How and why did Reverend Dandala join a neo-colonial liberal political party, Congress of the People, when the parties that support the Pan-African and Black conscious agenda at the same time wanted to use MCSA as the healing of nations for Africa? Is there some contradiction on his conviction of African Union agenda brought by Kwame Nkrumah? Did you get that, Mfundisi? Thank you. And then the last question, which I want you also to note, is from Uaviwe Mdaniso, who asked this question: how can a church be progressive in the debate of land redistribution when our own churches are built on stolen land? Our foundations are formed from that which was taken by the colonizers. So those are the two questions that I'd like you to deal with, Novej. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mfundisi. Norman, my friend Uchai, I think is really asking the wrong person, because Mfundisi Dandala joined the party much later, and his reasons are known to him. So I can't speak on his behalf. So I really want to request that he, is still there. He can ask him, and I'm interested to talking about a Christ-healed Africa. I hear what he's saying, and I respect the question, but unfortunately, respectfully so, I am unable to speak. I have no mandate to speak for Reverend Dandala. Secondly, maybe the part about the African and what he mentioned, Ukai mentioned, in this instance, Kwame Nkrumah. Ross Oliver once wrote something and said that the gospel, in fact, it was more, celebrated during the time of, the building of the Seth Mokitimi Methodist Seminary. And he said that the gospel needed to be now transplanted in an African soil so that it can get, African nutrients. Are we together? And so maybe, in fact, they said that Seth Mokitimi was an African port where leaders, transforming leaders for church and state will be formed. And maybe we need not to get tired, of talking about these things and trying to correct some of the mistakes of the past. But what I am more interested in, I don't want to get into the debate of where our churches are built and the land question. I think it is best, that that question, it is best now left, with the politician. In case I am quoted and said that I speak for the Methodist Church when I do not have a mandate to speak for conference. But what I would want to encourage, is that, friends, we need to begin to stop being victims of sorrow and lamentation. We need to start with what we have and shape the future that we hope to see. Make an example. No, I've said elsewhere, in fact, it has been written that every generation has its own mandate, and it is up to that generation to fulfill or to betray her generational mandate. What we need to remember I always say to people, I do not steal, not because opportunities to steal do not present themselves, but I do not steal because I know that history will one day judge me. And I do not wish that when my children visit my grave one day, spit on my grave. I wish that my children will bring wreaths and flowers and say, here lies a man of God, a true African. So I am saying, let us use what we have and shape the future that we are hoping for. We have land. How many of our circuits are doing something about the land that they have? How many of our circuits are using their resources to make sure that in the next 10 to 15 years, they give, a break in terms of some of these things that get to be collected emabandleni ethu. We need, for an example, I am waiting for the church to invest in what, for an example, the likes of Reverend Kuluba are doing. It can be done. We can plant, we can produce, we can do agri-processing. It can be done. If Gaddafi showed in Libya that from where i-oil egrunjwa khona up to where iphume empompeni iyakwazi ukwenzeka, it is the time now. It is a time now that inkonzo yethu i-investe and support, monitor some of these programs that are being done kwindawo ezifana ne-Frankspar. Because alukho, kukho ingoma apha kwisile ethi phaya phezulu uncedo alukho. Izinto esizifunayo, we need into yoba sizishape ngoku. Looking forward to a day apha isekethe esifana no-Fransbury okuzawuthiwa for the next 3 years or for the rest of their lives akuzobakho khona, because ukhona wabo investwe kwezi programs ezikwaziyo ugenerator i-income for i-Frankspari, iqeshe abantwana base-Frankspari ukwenzela into yoba ekugqibeleni ingabi yocawa that it appears to be life-taking, but icawa izipositione as a life-giving station. And that begins with us. It begins with me. It begins with you. Thank you, Mfundisi. You mustn't forget to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mfundisi Mtambe. As I said earlier, that this discussion will make sure that we speak to those who are the admins of this group to make sure that we come back with the second round. I think the questions of church and land and mission reserve, it is very critical for us to look into that as well. And we hope that we'll be able to engage people who are in the know-how of how land reform and land distribution when it comes to mission reserves is dealt with. We just want to end this discussion by appreciating everyone who has made comments on the Facebook page of Wesley Guild SA. And as I said, moving forward, we will ensure that we use this Zoom platform for us to be able to have an interactive discussion and facilitate future discussions. And we appreciate your inputs that we are going to be having as moving forward. As I said, one of our young Wesley Guilders will be the anchor of this platform to ensure that we empower young people in making sure that they get skills that the church is always given skills, especially the Wesley Guild. I always tell people that I am the product of this movement, and this movement has trained me to be what I am today, and will continue to plow back into this movement and ensuring that our young people are empowered. Just Gxamza, before we close, tomorrow we'll be having Mr. Bikwane, who will be talking to us about broken families. I think it is a very important topic, especially during this time of COVID-19. Please tune in tomorrow at 6 o'clock on the same platform, and we're looking forward to be engaging with you. Thank you very much, Mfundisi Mtambo. We appreciate you from the rural Eastern Cape of Engusha. That's where you're coming from us live, and we pray for your traveling mercies as you will be traveling back to Johannesburg soon. Thank you very much to our host, Udlamini Nkosi Zizi, for being so generous with your platform in ensuring that this mission that God has put into these young people moves forward. Thanks to all of us who have been watching live. Because this is a church platform, come, let us bow our heads in prayer as we close. We close by this prayer of 404 from our Xhosa hymnals. Let us pray. Masithandaze. Thixo sikelela izwe lakowethu iAfrika. Onyana nentombi bezizwe zakuthi sibabeka Nkosi phambi kwakho. Nkosi sikelela bonke abafundisi bezwi lakho, abayihambe ivangeli yakho kuzo zonke inhlanga mayifike. Nkosi sikelela bonke abafazi bomthandazo, amabandla onke amanyane ngawe abe yinto enye ngomthandazo. Nkosi sikelela bonke abaphathi bezikolo engakumbi kwelixesha lokulungiselwa kokuvula kwezikolo ngexesha ka-COVID-19. Sikelela bonke abantwana abafundiswayo zubaxhase bawo emfundweni. Nkosi khawusize abo bangaphandle kwezwi lakho abasemnyameni abakhanyisele ngevangeli yakho basindiswe ngoku nangonaphakade. Amen. And now may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen. Thank you very much. Siyabulela sibamba ngazo zozibini for your participation kule nkqubo. Sithi side sibuye sihlangane kuxesha longomso. Inkosi mayibe nani inisikelele ngalo lonke ixesha. Siyabulela.